Good evening, everyone, to tonight's Chifley conversation with Tanya Plibersek. The Chifley Research Centre is located on Ngunnawal land, and I'm coming to you tonight from Dja Dja Wurrung land in the Kulin Nation, and Tanya is speaking to us from Gadigal land. On behalf of the Chifley Research Centre and on behalf of everyone participating, we'd like to pay our respects to the custodians of the lands upon which we're all meeting tonight, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Tanya, welcome.
Really nice to be with you, David.
I'm not going to give you a big introduction because you probably don't need it, but as everyone knows, Tanya is the member for Sydney and currently the Shadow Minister for Education and the Shadow Minister for Women. She's been a deputy leader of both the party and the opposition in her time, and she was first elected back in 1998. And indeed, I can remember that because at the time I was working for Kim Beazley, and we occasionally share same floor of offices with Tanya's then employer, Senator Bruce Childs. So she's been in the Parliament a long time and done a lot of things. And of course, she's been a cabinet minister in the Gillard and the Rudd government. So welcome tonight, Tanya. We're here mainly to talk about the impact of COVID on higher education. And you've had a number of things to say there. And of course, we've seen some of the latest ABS stats. And the last time I looked, I think some 50,000 higher education employees had lost their jobs. And it's very clear now that it's starting to affect the tenured workforce, not just the casual workforce. And then we've had the impact on students, domestic and international, and the obvious implications for what is, one of Australia's largest export industries. So I suppose we'll start off with something that you've been saying quite recently, and that we should be taking a look at these things again and perhaps even investigate a bipartisan accord. But could you give us your take on where things are at? Is the damage actually permanent, or is it something we can get at?
Well, I really hope not, but I do think it's going to take us a while to recover. But perhaps maybe if we take a step back, if you'll just indulge me for a second. I'm on Gadigal land, as you said, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm very grateful to you, David, for inviting me to talk to you tonight about higher education. But I think higher education sits in a broader context of how we recover from COVID more broadly as a nation. And in the first lockdown, one of the books I read was Stuart McIntyre's fantastic history of the rebuilding of Australia after the Second World War. Obviously, Curtin, Chifley, Nugget Coombs, all of those great characters of Australian history and Labor leaders were already thinking during the sacrifices that Australians were making during the Second World War about how life could be better after the war. And they were thinking about higher levels of home ownership and full employment as two of the planks of rebuilding prosperity and fairness in Australia after the Second World War. And I really took that history to heart when I was thinking about how Australia should be after we come through COVID, because we know that even before COVID hit Australia, we had flatlining wages, we had increasingly unaffordable housing, we had widening gaps in our education system between the least advantaged and the most advantaged children, and those gaps were showing up very early and actually broadening during a child's life, during their time in formal education. And so I think it's really important for us to think as a Labor Party and for you at Chifley to be working on this broader question of, given Australians have sacrificed so much over the last 18 months, given that we have achieved so much as a nation, what's on the other side of that? What is the reward? And I think good quality jobs, a prosperous society, strong economy, but the benefits of that prosperity shared more broadly, these are obviously things that a Labor Party or a Labor government would want. And higher education, universities, TAFE, schools, early childhood education is one of the keys to achieving that, not just in the next year or two, but over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. It's going to be a really critical part of our rebuilding. And what's extraordinary about this is that the Liberals don't seem to see it that way. So on the one hand, they'll say we want universities to commercialise more of their research, but on the other hand, we've seen thousands of researchers lose their jobs, and it's not just the usual people that Liberals hate. The sort of feminist film studies majors that they make fun of, but actually, as you said, about 40,000 people have lost their jobs in higher education. The last figure I saw for researchers was about 7,000 researchers have lost their jobs. We know that this is an export industry that was bringing in about $40 billion a year in export earnings. And the money from that was funding research. So I don't know where the government thinks that the funding for research is going to come from. And we've recently had these big changes to the way student fees are charged, allegedly to make it more appealing to study certain disciplines, but in fact having the impact of doubling university course fees for a whole bunch of disciplines and making it actually less appealing for universities to offer courses in things like science and engineering. So it is a bit of a mess. I don't think it should be it's not impossible to fix. It's obviously, we've got really good fundamentals in our higher education system, but another term of neglect and hostility from the Liberals isn't going to help matters.
Yep. So what's the answer to that? Because, I started my career, working for politician John Dawkins, and, he made a lot of changes, mainly for the good, but they were controversial at the time, but they're all funded on the predication that there would be a good funding base, we would expand the sector, we would improve equity, and then government would stay out of it. But since then, and particularly Conservative governments, have shown that they don't stay out of it, and they fiddle with things like the fees, and they fiddle with research, etc., etc. Now, you've spoken of an accord. It's interesting looking back on some of the history of this. Robert Menzies, of all people, had a universities commission to do a similar sort of thing, sort of keep the structure of what Labor had commenced with the post-war reconstruction effort, cement the foundations, and then get government to step back from the politics of it in order to preserve the sector. How do we get to that sort of situation to implement something like the accord you've spoken about?
Well, Menzies, of course, is a really interesting character, because today's Liberals would say to you, universities should be just like TAFE. You just stay there a little bit longer. And Menzies was the first to say that universities should not just be training for a job. Universities should be a place where people go to, broaden their horizons. Essentially, was his argument. Look, I think one of the problems is there's been so much change in university policy. There's been so much uncertainty. It's very difficult to plan. It's hard for the universities to plan ahead. But there should be things that as a nation we can agree on. And that's the idea behind the accord. What is the role of the university for the individual? Well, obviously, it is about the sort of education you need to do skilled work, but it should be more than that. Can we agree as a country that university is about getting a job and also broadening your horizons? I would hope so. And then what is the role of the university in our national prosperity? Do we agree that universities are about training the next generation of skilled workers? Let's hope so. Do we also agree that universities have a critical role in research, the sort of research that will underpin new invention, discovery, new businesses, more Australian jobs? Let's hope we can agree on that. Do we agree that universities are a critical export dollar earner? What share of university revenue do we think is it reasonable to rely on government for, or do we think that universities are all going to be self-funding by taking more and more international students? What does that do to student experience and our reputation internationally? If we could start with some of these first principles answers, I think we'd get less in the weeds, working out whether we can afford to charge more for a bachelor degree, and actually give universities a solid footing on for them to plan as well for years and decades in the future.
Right. And I mean, turning to that question of the universities as an export sector, I mean, there's two sides to that. I mean, increasingly, the funding policies have become skewed to drive universities down that path in order just to fund their ordinary existence as domestic-oriented educators, as well as funding, the recurrent operations of delivering export services and indeed, hosting overseas students. COVID aside, have we got ourselves in a sort of terrible trap on this sort of thing where we're hostage to a stable international world? We're also hostage to Australia maintaining a good reputation and brand, as it were, in essence, having a good ranking in soft power. And it appears that if we're to look at, say, the UK and the US as our potential competitors, that while we are locked down, they are moving to exploit those very issues, those advantages that we've had. And how do we get that back?
Look, I think most people would agree that some institutions have been over-reliant on international student revenue in recent years. I don't know that they've had a lot of alternatives. That you can get money from government, you can charge students more, or you can have more international students. And successive governments have, pushed universities into this direction of more aggressively pursuing into the international student market. I think there are some courses and some institutions where that has begun to impact on the student experience, both the international student experience and the domestic student experience. And so we do have to have a really serious look at properly funding our universities so that we're not relying on international student revenue to fund the basic role of the university in teaching Australians and doing research. But I think we have to be careful about, there's some people who see this wholly as negative, and a lot of Australians believe that international students take places from Australian students, which of course is the exact opposite of what's true. They're subsidising Australian students, but I think it's important when this is done right. This is, good export dollar earner, good funder of research. It's fantastic for soft power, as you just said, but it's also a great opportunity for Australian students to make friends, connections that last them a lifetime. It's a great opportunity to link, Australian businesses with people who'll go back to their country of origin and take fond memories of Australia and continue to do business with us. There is a really good long-term benefit as long as we are responsible and thoughtful and don't just, churn through to get the maximum dollar value. People talk often about being broader in attracting people from a number of different markets, which obviously is wise if we possibly can do it. The reason that obviously China has been such a large share of our market in recent years is because there's a billion people with, hundreds of millions moving into the middle class who've got a little bit of money to spend. It's pretty hard to find a market as big as that anywhere else. But of course, we do need to diversify. We've seen the risks of putting all our eggs in one basket in recent times. If the government of China urges its citizens not to study in Australia, well, we know what happens.
Yeah. Turning to the research side of things, I mean, historically, Australia was very reliant on government. I mean, Australia used to perform, and still performs not badly in international stakes on research, but the skew of our funding was, in comparison to other countries, very much towards the government funding end of things, and comparatively low industry participation. And we also relied very heavily on the CSIRO. Those things have changed a lot over the last 30 to 40 years. Is there something that we can do to better enmesh the research side of our universities with onshore Australian companies, or do they have to continue to look to overseas companies who are perhaps more used to this sort of collaboration?
Look, I don't think we should underestimate some of the really fantastic collaboration that's already going on. And I think it's, we've got the government at the moment saying the big change they want to make to university research is more commercialisation. There is literally no one in Australia who says, gee, it's a bad idea if we discover something to commercialise it here in Australia if we can. I think it's from the government, it's a bit of a diversion from the fact that they're cutting research funding, and they're particularly cutting research funding for basic research and researcher-driven sort of research. Now, I think there is some argument for kind of focusing on some of our areas of excellence and really, pumping a larger share of our funding into the things that we do really well that will make a big difference to the way Australians live. We've got just as one example, we've got a terrific advantage in things like solar technology, and why wouldn't we, try and make that an area of first-class research, commercialisation, hopefully exporting to the region. Of course, it makes sense. We've got terrific models that have worked quite successfully, in some cases for decades, like the cooperative research centres that I think are now in their 30th year, and the Great Labour Innovation. And they are exactly what the government says they want to do. They want to work with researchers, set them up with businesses, incubate, grow. Why are we pretending that we don't have the recipe for this when we do have the recipe for it? What we don't have is continued funding at an adequate level to really take the areas of advantage that we have and make something from them, something more substantial from them. We know how to do it. We've got great examples where we are doing it. We arguably don't have a sophisticated enough startup funding environment, but I just don't think it's as mysterious as people make it, or as difficult as people make it, or as like something we should do in the future. I think we've got so many of the elements of it now. What we don't have is a vision and a commitment.
So we should perhaps just have a bit more confidence in ourselves rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Well, there's so many pockets of excellence in what we do in our research, and even great examples where we have commercialised great Australian success stories. We just keep we keep pretending that we don't know what to do when we do. We just don't do enough of it.
Okay, we just need to get on with it.
Okay. Get on with it. Pull our socks up. Get on with it.
Fair enough. We might turn to some audience questions, and I'd ask for people in the audience if you can keep your questions on the Q&A function of the Zoom app rather than spreading them back and forth across Q&A and the conversations, because they become a bit hard to track. But Annette Bennett came out with some early questions. We've been focusing very much on universities as we've been talking about TAFE. And admittedly, TAFE is administered by the states, of course, but it's changed a lot from its traditional conception. What role is there for TAFE, and what can we be doing at a national level for TAFE?
So I think schools, TAFE and university should be working much more closely together. We should be thinking more about careers advice that gives people options about the sort of work they can do. Should be able to do a certificate at TAFE that articulates into a bachelor degree. You should be able to do a bachelor degree with a few units at TAFE. We really need to see a much better integrated post-secondary school education system. We know that 9 out of 10 jobs that will be created in the next coming few years will need a post-secondary education, and the majority of them will need a university qualification. Our world of work is becoming increasingly sophisticated, but TAFE should be a huge part of it, and an integrated part of it. We've got 140,000 fewer apprentices and trainees today than when the Liberals first came to office, and we've got in some locations high and entrenched youth unemployment, and we've got skills shortages for a whole lot of jobs that you could do if you spent a couple of years at TAFE. It is mad that we combine skill shortages, youth unemployment, and cutting resources to TAFE. And it's frustrating. It's because it's exactly contrary to the pretense that the Liberals have that they're all in favour of blue collar jobs, and if only there were more tradies in Australia, Australia would be a better country. You can't say that on the one hand and then cut TAFE funding on the other hand. They've cut about $400 million off the top of my head in recent budgets from TAFE. So we need to better fund it, but we also need to modernise. We haven't done a really good look at the TAFE system since the Kangan review, which again must be close to 40 years ago now. The last big universities review was the Bradley review, which is about 10 years ago, I think, maybe a bit longer. So having a modern, fit for purpose TAFE system where people can do things better coordinate with university, but also do things like speed up the how long it takes to do a qualification. If you're a mid-career job changer and you've got a family to support and a mortgage, it's a bit hard to take 4 years to qualify through your TAFE course and your apprenticeship to do a new job. We need to be making sure that the institutions are modernised and fit for purpose. What I don't want to see, just incidentally, is a really atomised system of qualifications that says you don't need to learn to be an air conditioning mechanic. You only need to learn how to install this one type of air conditioning machine, because we trap people into lower skilled jobs if we atomise qualifications too much.
So in saying that, you're suggesting that you could potentially go the wrong way with micro-credentialing where it
Yeah.
becomes limiting rather than a series of steps into a bigger.
Yes, and that's why it's really important to think about how these things integrate, how they fit together, and that includes reducing the really artificial barriers between TAFE and university education. It doesn't mean that every university has to be a dual sector university TAFE, institution, but it does mean that we have to think about how people can, throughout their lives, upgrade their qualifications in the easiest and most effective way.
So, to put it crudely, perhaps moving to a model akin to the German system of pathways and a willingness to recognise vocational and trade skills for what they are, and also to recognise that they are things that can lead on to the more purist version of university provision.
And I think the really good thing about the German model as well is there's a real respect for skilled manual work in the qualifications framework, and the qualifications framework is reviewed and updated. It seems to me quite effectively, because you've got in many workplaces good levels of cooperation between the union and management, and having relevant updated qualifications is part of that.
Yeah, okay. Might turn to a question from Barbara King. Barbara's wondering what we can do to empower women and give them a better sense of financial independence, and what could Labor in particular do to encourage more women into higher education, and watch things like recent fee increases in areas that may have targeted skills that are in demand in the workforce, that in parts of the workforce that have higher female engagement.
It's such a great question. I think there's two things that we need to do really urgently. The first is encourage both men and women to study outside the traditional gendered occupations for their sex. I think more women should go into non-traditional trades and areas where they can earn higher wages, but also more men should take on caring professions, because it's the only way realistically that we're going to see decent pay rises in some of those areas. One of the reasons that you can earn more stacking shelves at Woolies than you can in early childhood education and care is because it's a predominantly feminised workplace, and people take for granted that women do caring work virtually for free, or they should do it virtually for free. So breaking down gender barriers in occupational choice is important, but also having an industrial relations system that makes it possible for largely female-dominated industries to actually get successful outcomes from work value cases, like the one that the early childhood educators tried to take and that was unsuccessful. There's something wrong. Basically, there is something wrong with an industrial relations system that can find that early childhood educators are not underpaid. There's something wrong with the system that thinks paying an adult, $22 an hour to care for children when they've got a 3 or 4 year qualification, we've got to fix that. On the issue of universities, I mean, we've got a really, probably more women at university than men, but they are choosing, in a lot of instances, feminised courses that will lead to underpaid work. The fact that that's been exacerbated by the government actually putting up the cost of things like social work in the last lot of changes is just, inexplicable, really. It's inexplicable. Those idealistic young women are going to graduate to jobs that pay crap money, and they're going to stay on crap money for most of their careers if we don't change it, if we don't set out to deliberately change it.
I mean, you've pointed to a problem that we discussed at some length in our last Chifley conversation, and that's this issue of the feminised caring sectors where there are challenges with skills delivery, and now there's more expensive skills delivery, and in addition to that, the work is undervalued. Do you think the current pattern of government policy is actually going to entrench that? Because
that's a real gimme of a question.
Yeah.
Of course it will. I mean, what we're heading for now is this fantastic program, the National, just as an example, National Disability Insurance Scheme, fantastic program. What a great idea. We are going to put the power in the hands of the person with a disability to make choices about what they want out of life and how they're going to achieve that, and we're going to fund accordingly. In the hands of the Liberals, it changes to a program of how can we, as cheaply as possible, deliver a few services to people with disability, and where are we going to cut corners? We're going to make sure that we've got an Uber Eats style system of delivering services where the fastest growing part of the Australian workforce, disability care workers and healthcare workers, are on insecure contracts with no guarantee of hours, poorly paid, at the mercy of, some excellent sort of providers, no doubt, but plenty of quite dodgy providers who are trying to screw down the price of the person actually delivering the service and take more of the funding as the middle person. It's just heartbreaking, actually, because we know what the opportunity is here. The opportunity is skilled work, people at entry-level work with good qualifications moving through a definable career path. So you look at male-dominated industries where there's people moving in and out of contract kind of work. What you often see are provisions like leave following the worker from one workplace to another. So accruing annual leave, accruing long service leave, accruing sick leave and so on. We don't see anything like that. We don't see an entitlement to training for people who are going into disability care work. I mean, what a great thing it would be if, when you started as a 22-year-old in this industry, you could say to yourself, I'm going to get the support to be running this service when I'm 40. There's no identifiable thought given to pathways through the industry at the moment. And if we don't do that, we're going to lock the fastest growing group of people, entering the workforce into low paid, insecure work at our peril. It's not just bad for them. It's not just bad for the people they're looking after. How can we grow? How can we have economic growth when we don't have confidence, when we don't have certainty, when we don't see wage rises, when we don't see aggregate consumer demand increasing? How can we expect our economy to recover when the fastest growing area of unemployment is paying people poorly and not guaranteeing that they'll have a job next week or next month? We can't recover. We can't recover if that's the employment growth that we're relying on. Sorry, You got me on a bit of a favourite subject there.
No. I mean, you've made some very powerful points. I might just draw that out. I mean, do you think that these issues have got to the extent that, aside from what it's doing for marginalising women and what threat it potentially poses for an economic recovery, that it's actually going to dramatically increase inequality across the Australian economy, in that you've got strong sectors, export-led sectors of the economy that are still doing not badly and stand to recover quite well, yet the growing sectors of the workforce are the caring sectors, and some of the increasingly casualised retail, service provision, hospitality and catering sectors. So is this sort of further dividing us into a large group and growing group of employees who are either underemployed, casualised or undercompensated, and a small group who are sort of doing quite well because they might be either technologically adept, they might be good knowledge workers, or they might be working the resource sectors?
So I think Matthias Cormann kind of let the cat out of the bag when, before he got his job at the OECD, he said low wages growth is a deliberate part of our economic strategy. And I think I don't want to for a moment say that the NDIS is a bad program. It's changed the lives of so many people. It's made such a difference to people with disability and to their carers and family members and so on. So I don't for a minute want to sound like I don't like it as a program. It's fantastic. What I don't like is locking people into insecure work with no foreseeable pay rises. And this is a bigger problem in health, community services, aged care, a bunch of the areas that have, predominantly female workforces. But it's not only a problem there. Like if you look at Uber delivery riders, any of the kind of gig economy workers, there is a risk there as well. I think the thing that we need to be looking at is the insecurity of the work and the pay rates, because these are deliberate choices in our industrial relations system. I mean, you mentioned the mining sector. Mining sector's traditionally been very well paid, as you know, a lot of competition for skilled workers at boom times. And yet we have examples where employers are trying to lock out or reduce the hours or get rid of their permanent workforce to replace them with contract labour on 30% lower wages, and you have two workers working side by side doing exactly the same work, and one of them's being paid 30% less. I mean, actually there is something wrong with an industrial relations system that doesn't have the same rate of pay for people doing the same work. So I am worried about the increased growth of underpaid, insecure caring work. I'm also worried about that spreading into other areas of the economy, because the government's making a deliberate choice to do that.
Right. While we're on the question of deliberate choices or potential deliberate choices, James Cockayne points to George Megalogenis's now not so recent quarterly essay, but it came out in July. And George has an argument that what he perceives as the government's hatred and potential attack on universities is partly explained by the fact that the sector skews disproportionately to Victoria in particular and Southeast Australia in general, and potentially cosmopolitan elites in those areas. Now, George, like he plays tennis, plays big strokes, and he's played some big strokes making those claims. But I'm just wondering, do you see any truth in that, even implicitly underlying some of the government's choices it's made about higher education?
I think the government hates universities because university educated people are more likely to vote Labor. I really do. And what they try and do then is portray universities as full of wankers. That's their, you know, the kind of fuel that they're using is this idea that it's all about elitist, you know, people removed from the sort of salt of the earth types that they are. It's hypocritical. I mean, I'm pretty sure every cabinet minister's got at least one degree. I think a lot of them have got 2 degrees. Dan Tehan, who was the minister that doubled university fees, had 3 humanities degrees, despite the fact he was putting up the cost of humanities degrees for thousands of other students. I think it's really base politics, and they're going after, they want the votes of white men, middle-aged men from the suburbs, and they think that pretending that universities are full of elitist snobs and then attacking them is part of the political strategy to appeal to that group of voters. I don't think it's any more complicated than that, and it is devastating. I mean, you know, the 40,000 jobs that have been lost, of course, are researchers and academics and tutors, but they're also cafeteria workers and librarians and admin assistants and gardeners. If you take 200 jobs out of Townsville or Cairns or Launceston or Dubbo or Armidale, you really notice that in the local community and in the local economy. The idea that universities are elitist is also pretty maddening. I mean, one of the things that was most noticeable about Julia Gillard's policy that uncapped access to university is that we saw huge, probably was 190,000 additional students got the chance to go to university. But we saw huge increases in kids from rural and regional areas, from English and, you know, as a second language background, Aboriginal students, students with a disability, all of the groups that had traditionally struggled to find a place at university, massive increases in those groups. It's elitist because, well, it's, you know, elitist under them because who can afford $60,000 for a degree? Who can afford $50,000 for an arts degree or $60,000? We are seeing it become elitist because they're making it unaffordable for working class kids to go to university. This notion that, you know, university folk are different from you know, the salt of the earth, you and me types, it's just not real life in Australian families. Like, you can't be so many families where you've got 2 parents, one of them's got a university degree and the other one hasn't, or they've got 3 kids and one will go to university and 2 won't, or they'll all go to university or they'll all go to TAFE. Nobody cares except the negative culture warriors of the Liberals who think there's a vote in using this as a sort of us versus them division. And by the way, it means they can save a few $1 billion along the way.
Mm. We'll probably have to sort of close on this, and I'll just ask a question that was raised by Tony Dillon, who's saying, absent the prompt return of overseas students, what sort of funding gap are we looking at the moment?
Well, about $2 billion a year. About 2, yeah.
Right.
So it depends how you measure it, but in the last 2 years, we've seen about $3.8 billion lost because of the restrictions on international student numbers, and that will we're talking about 500 students coming into New South Wales between now and Christmas. That won't even begin to touch the sides of the revenue lost, and the universities will feel it, but so will the landlords, the restaurants, the entertainment venues that cater for international students, and so will the businesses that relied on them for labour as well. There's a real, there'll be a bigger impact than just the lost fees and lost revenue.
Well, look, on that note, Tanya, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. It's been a tremendous chat, and I think we've all learned a lot. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Next week, we'll be having a little bit of a departure from policy, but not too far. We'll be going back to some things that Tanya started with tonight, which was Labor's focus on reconstruction and indeed planning of expanding areas like the university sector towards the end of World War II, because we will be meeting again the night before the 80th anniversary of the Curtin government. And of course, it was John Curtin, aided by John Deadman, and then later, of course, Ben Chifley, who picked up the threads of some of the things that we've been talking about tonight. So I hope everyone can join us for that. We'll be sending out details towards the end of the week. And thank you very much and good night.
David, can I say, if people want to read more about higher education policy, that's Upturn. That's the book that I edited about the COVID stuff. Looks weird in the screen because it's reversed.
Tanya,
anyway.
As I say, available on all these things, available at every good bookstore, recommended. I think it was one of about 7 different ALP policy books I read over the Christmas break, and it was certainly the best edited one.
You need to get out more. You need to get out more if that's what you're doing on your Christmas break.
I do indeed.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for a great night.